Let me start, though, with having a possibility for questions from you. If you have any questions on this, on the work itself, things that you have allegedly read, anything of that nature. I think that, yeah, he's doing the myth because I don't know if they're there yet. The reason I balk at your question being, are his interlocutor's philosophers? The reason I balk at the question, I think he intimates that they're philosophic souls. People that really long for the truth. They long for seeing this vision or understanding this vision. And yet they're not there. They have impediments. They have personal baggage. They have not gone to the effort yet to discover these things. They're young, whatever it is. Something is impeding them from fully understanding this thing. Can you then call somebody who's a potential philosopher, potentially capable of seeing this? Would you call them a philosopher? Or are they simply a soul who is yearning for the truth, but not yet in philosophic standing? I don't really know if I have an answer to that. My personal opinion would be that they are a philosopher potens rather than a philosopher actens. A philosopher who has a capacity for it. I see this all the time as a teacher, 18 years now. I see students who are very, very good at putting things together and understanding something, very inquisitive, and they have a gusto and a desire to learn. They are a philosopher potens. And that's very different from the student who's just there for the grade, who was just there in order to do time, who was just there, warming a seat, who's not. The philosopher potens is somebody who you can work with, who really does have a great deal of potential. And whether or not that potential comes to fruition or not, who knows? That's up to the God. That's up to chance, whatever you want to say. But they certainly have potential. I don't know whether I'd call them philosophers yet, though. Yeah. And he says another point, being humorous, he says, philosophy among the young is a very dangerous thing. Because, of course, what he means is that there are a lot of young people who have such great capacities naturally, that then they take those capacities and do all sorts of silly things for them, or they have a source of pride in their philosophy, or they're just posers. And he says that's very dangerous. Rather, he says, don't call them philosophers until they're old, until they've suffered enough. Suffering is a wonderful teacher. Don't ask for it, it will come. But suffering is something which is an amazing teacher, because it really teaches you humility, and consequently teaches you what's important and what isn't. And it's only once you've suffered enough, I think, that you can actually be called a philosopher. Jack?
Yeah, I was going to say, what if a college professor that doesn't believe in the divinity of God?
Very good question. I've actually had that before, and even kids have gone off to even the young adults who've gone off to college have asked me about this. Would a college professor who doesn't believe in God and divinity have a similar vision? I won't say it's impossible. I'm sure there's some professors that don't believe in divinity that would have this kind of, or understand it this way. I will say that if you begin to understand what he's talking about, it would be very hard to then turn around and say, it's a bunch of bull. It'd be very difficult to do that because it's such an overpowering concept that it would, if nothing else, force you to have to rethink what you meant by belief. Whether or not a person believes in their heart in the divine, the afterlife, in Jesus, is up to them. That's a very personal thing. Whether a person says this is magnificent and has tremendous power is not up to them, because it is magnificent and it does have tremendous power. Whether or not they personally believe it is their own thing, because there's no reason to intrude on somebody's personal life that way. But if they see this as magnificent, powerful, and then turn around and say it's a lot of hogwash, that's just, in some ways, intellectual dishonesty. So I would be very surprised, if you met a professor who had thrown out the baby with the bathwater and said there's no God, there's no soul, there's no afterlife, and then turns around and says, this is gorgeous. It would be hypocritical. I don't think it would be possible for them to do so. Either they're going to say, this is gorgeous and beautiful and magnificent, and has a lot of power to it, and I believe it. Or they're going to say, I don't understand this. But I don't see how they say both.
we have to go back for a minute and realize what he's talking about knowledge. When he says that the people in the cave or in the Theaetetus have that knowledge and it's brought out of them, he's not talking knowledge like who won the Super Bowl in 1982, who's buried in Grant's tomb, things like that. That's not the type of knowledge that he's talking about. What he's talking about is the real knowledge that was important to him. Knowledge of yourself, knowledge of who you were. That is knowledge of your own place in the pattern of the universe. That type of knowledge, he says, is embedded in everybody because we are part of this pattern. So we're recognizing the very fact that we have participation in this thing. And that's the most important knowledge for him. All other knowledge, whether it's historical, scientific, whatever, is only there in order to highlight our own knowledge of ourselves. As a quick tangent, that's how all education used to be up until about the 19th century. That all education used to be primarily training people to understand who they were in the universe. So when you studied language or history or science or philosophy or anything, what you were primarily studying was something to allow you to understand who you were. Changed in the late 19th century and early 20th century so that you studied history in order to know history, or you studied science in order to know how to cut up a frog or something, or to get a job at a hospital. It was no longer a question of your knowing who you were or knowing yourself. It was a question of mechanics, if you will, learning a mechanical trade. That's what he means when he says the knowledge is already in you. Not a knowledge of who won the Civil War, or who, that kind of thing. The Germans. No. Really, it started with the Enlightenment in France and in Germany. In the Enlightenment in the 18th century, the movement was towards empirical knowledge, things we can measure, weigh, touch, taste, things like that. And the German empiricists, the German Enlightenment guys in the 19th century, set about changing the nature of education, to try and categorize education, compartmentalize it, separate one discipline from another, and have all of it be the purpose was not discovering your place in the universe, but became more practical. Like we study chemistry in order to blow stuff up, We study science in order to get a very good scientist or doctors or what have you. But it was a very practical, this world purpose in the German conception. And that division of education into discipline was a German invention that then carried over into the 20th century. We still operate under it. So we have what's called discrete education. What you do in science or math or language has no bearing on what you do here. It's over there. And that's why we have competing classes. In an ideal education world, that would not exist. What you learned in language would be brought here, and I'd be asking you questions like, how does this have bearing on the passive paraphrastic, or what does the nature of the structure of the frog have to do with understanding geometry? And you begin thinking of things in a total way rather than as discrete individual disciplines. In my estimation, it's a better way of doing education. It's in some ways more difficult because it requires you to synthesize all this stuff. But it's a better way of doing things because on the one hand, you don't have competing classes, but on the other, you're learning a whole vision rather than bits and pieces. That's what Mary Shelley, you remember Frankenstein? That's kind of what she was critiquing with this whole German thing to try and change the nature of education into bits and pieces. And next year you read T.S. Eliot in The Wasteland. That's what he's critiquing in The Wasteland. It's this new sense that we have lots of information at our fingertips, but no whole vision whatsoever. You can access anything on the internet, but it doesn't do you a darn bit of good because you don't have anything to put it into for contact. But he defines it, but he defines the good, but he doesn't define it as a single sentence. For two reasons. One is that if he defines it by a single sentence, he pins it down and limits it. We do this all the time. If you say the word God, okay, who is God? Well, he's the creator of everything. Got it. Now you're done with God. You don't have to think about God anymore, right? Who's Jesus? He's some cat that lived 2,000 years ago in the Middle East. Got it. You're done with Jesus. You don't have to listen to Jesus anymore. As soon as you pin it to a word or phrase, it's trapped, it's pigeonholed. You don't have to think about it anymore. And his whole point is that this thing, this good, is so magnificent that to pin it down is to limit it completely. Is to deplete it of its power. He doesn't want to do that. So he intentionally does not define it by a single word. The second reason he doesn't define it by a single word or a single sentence is that he can't. It is, again, it's so huge that he can't limit it to a single phrase or word. In a way, it'd be like trying to limit the ocean to somebody. What is the ocean? It's a big body of water. Is that it? Well, it's also salt. It's also really huge. You have to experience it. It's got waves. It's got octopuses and stuff in it. It's something where you can sort of define it and get a working idea of it, but you can't really limit the ocean to a single phrase. Big body of water. What, like a pool? It's something which, in a way, I think defies being limited to that phrase. So he doesn't come down ultimately and say this is what it is for intentional reasoning. Free will and choice. Plato was. I think he believed that free will and choice are things that are actually cultivated. That if you don't know the difference, you aren't really free. And how do you know the difference unless someone forces you to see both sides? So it's kind of a tricky paradox again. That if you left it up to the person in some sort of Montessori way, here kid, just do whatever you want and eventually you'll be educated. If you did that, the kid would end up playing with his nose and looking at birds the entire time. He wouldn't learn anything. He would sit there, But I think that that was a nice impression. I thought that was pretty good, actually. If, for instance, you drag a person to actually see things, think about things, he may not like that. He may not like it both. But eventually he sees the difference. And then he can choose because he's been forced to look at the two sides. But if you don't have two sides, you can't choose, right? If all you know is the darkness, how do you choose something else? You can't. You have to know the light, but you're never going to know the light unless somebody drags you towards it, because you don't want to go there. Right? Now, you may have a strong yearning, a longing to get out of the darkness. And he even intimates that because there are people that are free to their bonds and they turn around, and he doesn't say what frees them. It's not some philosopher. Which is why that video I think is wrong, where he touches the chains and he doesn't say it's a philosopher comes down and gets the guy. It's just somehow he's free. And then he turns and he sees the light. And at the moment he sees the light, he's like, ow, that hurts. Those shadows are a lot easier. And he has a tendency to gravitate back towards those shadows. Unless someone grabs him, and that's what it says, and imagine at that point someone grabbed him forcefully. Unless someone grabs him at that point and he drags him out, he will gravitate back towards the easier route. The chains and the slavery and the being tortured by the puppet handler. Consequently, freedom and free will are only really possible when we know the difference. And when we've been dragged out by somebody else forcefully to look at something, then we have the possibility of being free. If I could just give a plug for my own profession for a minute. That's why, for instance, teachers, when they do their job well, are doing such a service to people. Because what they're actually doing is making them free. Against their own will. Most people are like, we have to be free. Total freedom to do anything we want. Well, such a thing isn't possible, first off. But how do you have freedom if you don't know the difference? And the only way you're going to know the difference is by somebody dragging you, kicking, and screaming to know the difference. And you don't want to go there, so you have to have somebody to force you. The teacher that does this job is actually forcing students to be free individuals. Autonomous individuals. What? Yes, it is. Yeah, using the good is going back into the darkness. The person that has not just seen the good become one with it, because remember up here at the top of the divided line, you actually are not just looking at the good itself, you are now one with it. When you become one with the the good, you travel up the divided line and you see the good, and you actually are now acting and thinking in total concord with the good. When that happens, you end up doing what the good does, which is to descend into the world of forms. The one becomes the many. And you go back down into that many and you find the people that are also still trapped, and you have an obligation to bring them back because you are the good. You are the God. It's striking to me that at the top of this, when he says the good, but if we read the God, what it means is at the top of this, you and I become gods. The Christian thing has a very similar statement. It says, for instance, in the Mass, it says, by the mingling of this water and wine may we come to share in your divinity, who humbled yourself to share in our humanity. That statement, if you've been an altar boy, you might have heard it. It's a very profound statement because it means not that heaven is some little vestibule underneath the chair of God, like, Kansas or something. It's rather that when you become one with God, you are God. You become the God. And when you become the God, you do what the God does. And that's to descend back and to find other people who need help. Exactly like triangles, yes. But the whole purpose of our religion, the whole purpose of our holy life is to progress towards becoming like the God and then descending back into the dark to save people that are still in there. Very much so. Parable of Talents is telling exactly this story. Notice, too, in terms of the imagery, he goes up and he sees the sun, which is a big gold ring in the sky. And once he gets that big gold ring in the sky, he's obliged to use it to go back down into the dark again. Notice how it's a reversal of the little gold ring that's found in the dark and is used to dominate everybody. It's a total reversal of that Gygas myth. He flips the Gygas myth. So the Gygas myth is no longer the dominant myth. This now becomes the dominant myth. Well, on the one hand, he's saying the eye's being infected by darkness when the guy goes down into the cave again. On the one hand, he's saying that philosophers are frequently seen by people in this world as being freaks. They are seen as weirdos. They forget where their glasses are. They can't balance a checkbook. They don't follow the Chicago Cubs. What kind of loser is this guy? Because most people who are in the dark, Socrates think that sort of stuff is important. But the guy who has seen some other great vision beyond this world comes back and wants to talk about the vision. It's like, hey, let me tell you about the number pi. Isn't this beautiful, the way that this circle works and the way that it interacts? And most people are like, yeah, it's beautiful, whatever. You made Michelle Fox into it. Megan Fox into it. Most people can't get to that level of zeal and excitement over these wonderful ideas. And so on the one hand, he's saying this philosopher is seen by the world as being blind and deaf, like the ship captain. And they are annoyed at least, and they want to kill him at worst. The other thing that he's suggesting is that when he goes back down into the darkness, he's seeing something so tremendous and great that he can't really see the importance of it. Like the Oscars. Who gives a rip, right? It happens every year. And we know who's going to get the Oscar. And people are like, oh, the Oscars, who's going to win? Who gives a damn? If you've seen something beautiful beyond this world, the Oscars are like idiots giving prizes of plastic to idiots. It doesn't make any sense anymore to you. And consequently, your eyes are dimmed trying to, hey, is that Meryl Streep or is that Helen Mirren? And who the heck is that? You've seen something more glorious than the movie stage.